Hello, welcome to 8.9 News. I'm Costain. British Pasture Leather has created a traceable supply chain to produce leather entirely from UK livestock reared according to the principles of regenerative farming. Their vision is to link leather with agroecological agriculture and to forge new connections between farming, food and fibre. Sara Grady is a co-founder of British Pasture Leather, and I started by asking her how she defines regenerative leather.
From the perspective of British Pasture Leather, we are really looking at the agricultural origins of the raw materials. So for us, that refers to the farming practices in which those animals were raised. So really trying to make a connection between leather and agriculture, which ironically in leather material and in the leather trade is something that is not often done. So for us with British Pasture Leather, looking at the word regenerative, it really refers to looking at how that animal lived and its role in stewarding landscapes.
And are you looking at sort of environmentally friendly ways of tanning and processing the leather as well?
We are, yes. So we are currently working with a British tannery that uses a traditional method of what's called vegetable tanning, which has nothing to do with vegetables, but means that it was tanned using natural materials, which are tannins derived from barks and leaves, similar to the tannin you might have in your tea. Most leather in the world is tanned using chrome, which is a heavy metal, which we are avoiding because we're preferring to produce a material which at the end of its usable life will be biodegradable. There are quite a lot of innovations in the technologies for tanning, so there are other options. The challenge for us is that we've made a commitment to produce only in Britain, so really trying to create a localized supply chain. And sadly, the infrastructure for leather production in Britain has withered significantly. Just this year, 2 tanneries have gone out of business. So for the moment, we're working with the options that we have, and we're very fortunate to have the relationship that we have, as I said, with a tannery that uses a very traditional method, which is more natural.
Well, let's come back to the infrastructure point a little bit later. But first of all, why is it that you think regenerative leather is important? Why is it important as a supply chain?
Well, from my perspective, it's incredibly important to look at farming and food systems and the role that they play in our preservation of our ecosystems and biodiversity and the health of soils and land. And it has quite often been overlooked that leather is a product of our food system. So I feel that we have a huge opportunity when we reframe how we look at leather as a material in reconnecting it to agriculture and really considering how it is or can be a product of farming practices which are incredibly beneficial. So when we're talking about regenerative practices in the context of livestock agriculture, we're talking about holistically managed herds that are eating a diet of 100% pasture, and the effect of those animals on land in terms of their grazing of grass and the effect of their trampling and their manure on the land is incredibly positive for the health of that soil. And this is a well understood thing that when those animals are managed regeneratively, they bring incredible benefits to those ecosystems.
So where do you source your leather from, and how do you ensure that you get good quality hides that you can use to make things with?
Yeah, so one thing that I think we often have to clarify is that we are facilitators of a supply chain. So we have created an entirely new supply chain in the sense that we are identifying the farms that have been practicing, again, what we would call regenerative practices, and then taking those hides all the way through to the finished leather process. So we're not buying leather, we're producing leather. We are currently choosing farms that have a certification called Pasture for Life, which in the UK is currently the highest standard of livestock practices. And so we identify those certified farms. We identify the abattoirs where they're taking their animals. We procure the hides from the abattoir, and then we oversee the production all the way the abattoir through the tannery through the finishing process. And so the assurance of the quality of the hide is something that for us, again, goes back to the farm certification. So the question of quality as it relates to cattle hides for leather or finished leather is something that is defined, at least by us, quite differently, again, than the conventional trade in leather. So typically a more mainstream leather would be considered high quality if it has no scars and no scratches and is incredibly uniform and standardized in its surface character. We're looking at the question of quality quite differently. We're looking at it more along the lines of your earlier question of what is it that makes it regenerative? So that really means that we're preferencing those regenerative farming practices. And the result of that is that we have hides that are of a very high quality from the perspective that the fiber structure is strong, and there's a real density and a thickness to the leather. So it produces a very strong, durable leather. And that, of course, is because the animal has grown to its natural habit and has eaten the diet that it was meant to eat. It does mean that there's quite a lot of surface character on the leather if it were left in its natural state. So growth marks, scratches, scars, and that's something that we're dealing with quite creatively in terms of looking for brands and designers that can accept some of that character, but also using creative techniques to mitigate some of that character so that you still get quite a lot of yield from the finished material.
What do you do with them once you've taken them through that process? Do you turn them into products yourselves, or...
Not yet. Not yet. We're hoping to do that. We are currently set up as a producer of leather material for other brands and designers of leather goods. So we've been in the process, as we've been developing this supply chain over the last couple of years, we've been in the process of presenting this idea and communicating to brands and designers that make things like handbags and accessories and furniture and footwear. And we're just at the point where we're ready to sell small volumes of finished material to brands that wish to adopt this for their products.
Okay. So how has the fashion industry taken to the idea that leather can be a good regenerative product from here in the UK?
Well, it's very much in the zeitgeist in the sense that fashion and design are really looking into their supply chains and trying to understand the impact of the materials that have been chosen for, a range of products. And I think there's a huge receptivity to this. I think there's a real opportunity to, as I said, make a change in how we perceive this material. The reason that Alice and I set out to do this was because we both identified the fact that as it is right now, brands and designers don't have any choice when they're searching for leather material for, whether it's a chair or a handbag or a pair of shoes, because this distinction around farming practices does not exist in the conventional trade of hides and in leather production generally. So what we really set out to do was to give users and buyers of leather a choice so that they could know that when they're choosing the material or choosing a product made from that material, that it comes from regenerative origins. I think that there's a huge opportunity there. We are doing this at a moment when meat and leather are very much in the sort of critical crosshairs in our cultural discourse. And I often say this, but what I'm really looking for is more nuance in that, so that we don't have such a polarized notion that it's either all meat is bad or therefore you can't consume meat or animal products at all. I do believe it's a totally personal choice, but I also think that we need to have more general understanding of the fact that there are meat production systems that are incredibly positive and beneficial, where animals are raised to a high degree of welfare. And as I said, their presence on the land and in the pasture is incredibly positive, producing healthy food, looking after rural economies and rural landscapes. And so, that is where we have a real opportunity with this material to get into the conversation around leather, that there is an option that is not all bad.
Now, you mentioned abattoirs and tanneries earlier on. So finally, from your perspective, what needs to happen for regenerative leather to scale here in the UK?
Yeah, that is a very complex question. So on the one hand, there would need to be more access to leather production infrastructure, as I said. The systems that Alice and I are building have the potential to scale as the certification grows. So, for us, there will be some economies of scale when we can get more hides from regenerative farms in any particular location at an abattoir. By the way, and I'm sure your viewers know this, there is a crisis, of course, in the loss of small-scale rural abattoirs. So supporting that infrastructure is just as important as looking at the leather infrastructure. But there's another question here that has less to do with systems and has more to do with a sense of value. And leather is in our lives quite generally as an abundant commodity, cheap, abundant commodity, and re-looking at that and understanding that when it has come from regenerative systems, when it's come through a local supply chain like ours, which at the moment is quite relationship intensive, making it time intensive to coordinate, the resulting material has more value and also has a higher price. And so I think, again, really developing our understanding of this material and looking at its intrinsic values, its embedded values is part of that scale question.
That was Sara Grady from British Pasture Leather. More news on our website, 8.9.com. That's all for now. We're back soon. Thanks for watching.